hi, everybody. I'm in Washington, D.C. for a meeting called the National Conservatism Conference. Now, what does that mean, national conservatism? I think it might actually be the reverse, conservative nationalism. Nationalism has had a negative connotation for, I think, 2 generations, partly because Hitler called his socialists the National Socialists, which in German is shortened to Nazi. The C part is the socialist part, but the Na part was national. And I think that after the Second World War, there was a desire to destroy nationalism, at least in the West, thinking that that is what had caused so many wars. And so international institutions were built to blur over the lines of nations. In some ways, it was a great success. Think of the European Union and the trade amongst those countries. The theory was if France and Germany did an enormous amount of economic intercourse, perhaps they wouldn't go to war again. And if they can overcome the differences that borders give them, if they can be unified in some way, maybe they won't go to war ever again. And it was a utopian idea. And in some ways it worked, because really, how different at their core are French and German people? They're both Europeans, they're both Christian people. Of course, there are many differences amongst them too, but should those 2 nations naturally be at war with each other? Think, for example, of the United Kingdom. Great Britain and England and Scotland were at war with each other for generations, but now they're a united kingdom, and it's unthinkable that they would go to war against each other. So maybe that utopian vision could hold, except for by destroying the idea of nationalism and borders amongst those countries. The European Union and the United Nations and progressive NGOs and the World Economic Forum and all these other groups that sprung up to displace and minimize nationalism, they also erased the border around the European Union. And they allowed in millions, indeed tens of millions of people into the European nation who are not close cousins like French and Germans might be, but have very different worldviews, different religions, different cultures, different ideas about democracy, usually no ideas about democracy. For example, there are millions of Turkish people in Europe, especially in Germany, who have not assimilated. They've been there for, frankly, 2 generations, and they still fly their Turkish flags. One of the most astonishing things for me to see was Turkish politicians flying to Germany for campaign rallies in Germany, where Turkish candidates duke it out for the Turkish vote in Germany to vote back in Turkey. It's just astonishing. Anyway, I'm talking a lot about nationalism and the absence of it. And we have that same issue in North America, in Canada in particular. Do you remember when Justin Trudeau was first elected, he talked about Canada being a post-national country where we're really no more than a hotel room, when he said there's no core identity. Remember that?
Because at its best, Canadian identity is additive. I'm a proud Montrealer, I'm a proud Quebecer, I'm a proud Canadian. I see no contradiction between any of those elements, and we all have layers of identity that we add to, and our communities are more resilient because of all those multiple layers. But when it comes down to, if you can't identify what a Canadian is by surface attributes, like skin color, or language, or religion, or ethnicity, or background, or story, then how do we define the Canadian identity? How does a newcomer figure out, well, what do I need to do to become a Canadian and to feel like a Canadian? And it's not about hockey and poutine, although that helps. Tim Hortons is probably at the top of the line there. It's about our shared values. Those values of openness, compassion, search for justice, respect, a desire to be there for each other, desire to work hard. These are values that get their concrete articulation in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, but get their expression in the communities we live in every single day.
That would shock the late father, Pierre Trudeau, who spoke at length about the French identity. In fact, by official bilingualism, and so much of Canadian historical iconography is about the French nation and the English nation, who fought at the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, but then had a kind of working relationship hammered out. If you read our Constitution, you'll see the way that the French people and the British people came to harmony. And we put aside our wars with Quebec, and we've had 2.5 centuries of peace. There may be disagreements, but certainly not war. But the idea that there is no Canadian nation, that as Trudeau would say, we're just a place with no core idea, is not only offensive to Quebec nationalism and the Anglo national history, not to mention Aboriginal people. It's an excuse to open the door to mass immigration that has no connection whatsoever to Canadian culture, French, English, or otherwise. And I think it's reached a crisis in Canada under Justin Trudeau, who has literally quadrupled immigration in the last 2 years. And when you look around Europe, you see where that crisis will lead if we don't fix it now. This is a very long introduction to my point that what we saw in the United Kingdom on July 4th and what we saw in France on July 7th was a clash between the nationalist vision in the UK, as manifested by Nigel Farage and his Reform UK, that wants to strengthen the British military, strengthen British pride in their culture and history, stop mass immigration, increase prosperity, versus the Keir Starmer Labour and further left that wants an Islamification of the UK, mass immigration, and believe that London is an international city, not a great national capital of the UK. Same thing in France. On July 7th, the number one party in the vote, just under 40%, was Marine Le Pen's National Rally. Yet it only came in third place in number of seats, with leftist and far leftist parties gaming the political system, literally withdrawing hundreds of candidates to sort of game the system. It was a very stark choice. And the number one choice in terms of popular vote was for Marine Le Pen's French nationalism. But what won through that jiggery-pokery was an Antifa Islamist hard leftism, including actual communists and actual Antifa leaders getting elected. It's an astonishing choice, and the stakes in France and the UK could not be higher. I always say that Europe is a time machine where we can see our future in Canada 5 years from now. 5 years of eroding and diluting our national culture. 5 years of mass immigration. 5 years of political parties being an uni-party where no one dares to speak about these things. In France, they've broken the uniparty, and Marine Le Pen is a voice against immigration. Nigel Farage has finally broken that silence in the UK, and he got 5 seats, but over 4 million votes as his thanks for it. In Canada, I see Pierre Poilievre slowly mustering the courage to talk about immigration, but very, very carefully. He's not willing to come out against mass immigration. He says he'll reduce the numbers, but he won't give you the actual number, and he doesn't dare talk about the elephant in the room, namely Islamist immigration. We've seen these hate marches on our streets for the last 9 months, and they're overwhelmingly populated either by people who are not yet citizens or who have recently been naturalized and have brought with them ancient hatred to our country that hasn't seen them before. That's what I'm doing here in Washington. This is an American conference, and there are plenty of Americans here talking about American nationalism. But there's also a lot of Europeans here. My old friend John O'Sullivan, who's now with the Danube Institute in Hungary. Hungary is held up as an example here at the National Conservative Conference, a country that maintains its borders, has a pro-fertility agenda, i.e. trying to build up population by having babies, not importing people from the third world.